welcome to the Theology Pugcast. It's great to have you here. And I am accompanied today by the good folks here in Huntsville, Alabama. Yes, we have a live show. We've got a live show. Now, we're dead, but no, the audience is live. We've got Glenn in Indiana in his living room. We got Tom in Connecticut in his living room, and I'm here at Fractal Brewing with all of these wonderful folks here in Huntsville, Alabama. And just so folks know who we are, in case there are people still in the world who don't know who we are. I'm C.R. Wiley. I'm a pastor of a church and is in the Pacific Northwest, even though I'm here in Huntsville, Alabama. And I'm glad to be there. I've been a professor of philosophy. I've invested in real estate, and I've written some books. And my latest book is In the House of Tom Bombadil. That's enough about me. We'll kick it over to Glenn, and then we'll kick it over to you, Tom, and then you can take us into the subject of the day because it's your day.
Yeah, I'm Glenn Sunshine. I'm a retired history professor. My day job these days is working for Reflections Ministries in Atlanta, and I'm also a senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview.
All right. So, Tom, tell us about yourself, and then tell us what we're talking about.
Okay. I am Tom Price. I teach theology, Christian ethics, and philosophy, a few other things. One of the places is Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. And so the topic of the day. Well, the title is maybe a good way to begin, and I'm taking the title actually from a chapter in a fine book, which I'll talk about in a second. But the name of this is Virtual Morality, Propaganda as Social Glue. It's a great chapter for a book, and it has a lot of great context. But the context in which that chapter is just one is a book by John Rist, who is a fine moral philosopher. He actually has written a lot of his early work, I think, was a lot on the realist philosophers, Plato. I think several books on Plato. But then as he kind of converts to Christianity, for a bit later, he becomes quite the scholar of Augustine, and really looks at his whole vision, but especially a lot of the philosophical dimensions of his thought. But one of the things he does in this book is he talks about what is a person. He's asking a kind of a metaphysical question at this point. In this book is really unpacking something of the whole of Western thought up to the confusions of our day. And so just to kind of get an idea of some of the chapters, he starts, of course, his favorite with the realist philosophers, what he calls the foundations, Plato and Aristotle. Then he talks about this notion of persons that starts to develop with the Stoics and individuals, but really this notion of personae with Christian persons. And Christianity really, if you will, brings some of the richest dimensions to our understanding of what it means to be human beings, having a certain kind of unique endowment, each one of us made in the image of God. Both as gift and those that are able to share and communicate that gift, communicate the different endowments we have with others for the flourishing and well-being of the whole, if you will. So this rich understanding of the human person that grows out of what you would often talk about, the dignity of those made in the image of God. Really grows very thick, especially with St. Augustine. Of course, he's a big scholar of that, so he's going to bring that out. Now, some have looked at Augustine as someone who twists the Western notion of person from the rich Christian Eastern understanding. There has been a debate over several decades about whether or not the kind of Orthodox Christianity or Eastern Christianity altered the philosophical world to really make the personal at the heart of all reality, where Augustine is kind of accused of making the individual person rather than the persons in communion as the focus, thus leading to the demise in the West of community and the communal with a strong emphasis on the individual and atomistic. And I think what you'll see is with Rist's work is you'll see all that, if anything, all that kind of hyper individualism, subjectivism that we confront now is a deforming of and a distortion of what Augustine was up to. And I think most scholars will now say some of those theologians defending this kind of persons in communion were not very historically accurate, and Augustine really shares very much in common with the Cappadocians and everyone else.
Well, one of the things that I recall, in graduate programs I've been in is just what you mentioned, that Augustine is kind of the apostle of interiority, because of his work, Confessions, and that up to that point, we didn't have anything quite like that. Mm-hmm. And then after that, you've got people like Rousseau kind of, sort of echoing, but in a new direction, with his Confessions, and there are others. But there are some people that are secular in outlook, people like Harold Bloom, if I remember right, who really believe that Augustine kind of created the individual. So this is a live topic outside of Christian circles. I think it's one of the things that maybe can catch people by surprise, who aren't sort of tied into the sort of broader philosophical debates when it comes to the history of the West. Just how really much secular philosophers are interested in people that we think are our guys, because they see the larger sort of social implications of their work.
Yeah, it's hard to do medieval history, political thought, anything like that without doing Augustine. I mean, I don't care who you are, you've got to deal with them. But for our listeners who aren't as familiar with some of these debates and arguments, I think the best way I heard it summarized is Augustine was the first person in history to use the word I, as in first person singular, me, to use the word I the way a modern person does. Yeah. No one prior to Augustine did that. And that is a measure of his impact.
Yeah. Well, when you read the Confessions, you do feel like you're reading someone that you can relate to today. Yeah. Even though he's talking about a world that's, way in the rearview mirror, when he's talking about stealing pears or whatever. I kind of can picture it in my mind. I can kind of put myself in his shoes.
Yeah. And Rousseau did, in fact, very self-consciously try to become the new Augustine and counter him with his era of sensibility sort of writings, the Confession.
Yeah. Right.
And I would, you could easily see also Descartes, who similarly tries to take the notion of this idea we have of God that somehow could not have been something that we have come up with through our experience in any way, because there is nothing around like that. So where in the world does it come from? And he kind of traces some of Augustine follows some of these lines of thought.
And frankly, I think Therefore I Am, based on I Doubt, Therefore I Am. Augustine did that long before Descartes did. Yeah. Although I think Augustine had a much more balanced way of doing it. He just used it as a way of simply pointing out how ridiculous the skeptics were. He didn't try to build a whole philosophy around it.
That's right. And I think for Augustine, this is kind of worth talking about. I think for him, it was a way of recognizing, in a serious sense, that we're dealing with reality, and then we're also we're finite and we're contingent, and so he this is that whole process, especially when you look at his work on the Trinity, of this kind of psychological stepping up into. I mean, as he contemplates the way our subjectivity is structured, our mind and our in our thoughts, he begins to see something of a vestige, if you will, that gives us a kind of way of referencing the way in which the uttered word can both be God, and then the uttered word, like a thought. He's coming up with vestiges in our being made in the image that are finite, contingent, not comprehensive, but give us something of a language that we can use to talk about these things. And I do think I'd go out on a limb. I think there is probably far more theologically informed psychological material in Augustine that we haven't done anything with well in the West, and that we should return to. And there have been several works out there. But it's interesting you both mentioned Rousseau and I brought up Descartes because I think there's another work by John Rist that is called Deforming Augustine, where he talks about really the way his argument is not his argument is probably the better way to characterize a lot of the disintegration away from the robust and rich contributions of Christianity towards their distortions and then the mess we're in, can really go to the impact of Augustine and then the distortions as people bent and ran in different directions. And he, being on the Catholic side, would also see some of the Reformation of having bent and distorted Augustine as well. We can debate him on that. But his contribution otherwise is fantastic. Well, just to give you an idea where he goes, he'll get into...
Tom, quick side note. Ken Boa, my mentor and boss, his doctoral work at Oxford was published in a book called From Augustine to Freud. So he, too, was working on the psychological side of it for his doctoral, one of his doctorates.
Very nice. Yeah. I think, again, that is very unexplored territory on the whole. And you just... I think you have people that have tended to work on the side that, because he's from back then, he doesn't have anything to say to something, like our modern approaches to these things. And I think it's the other way around.
Well, yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that compared to Augustine, most of the stuff is not really all that profound.
That's right.
He's a giant for a reason. By the way, I should mention at this point, because I forgot to earlier, this is our 200th episode.
Yeah.
So, Tom, you are the guy who's doing the 200th episode, the subject of the day, and we're talking about Augustine, and that's great.
So nothing better.
Right.
And I have to say, I love Augustine. I mean, I'm always profounded by the rich insight he had. And what he has to offer. And again, I like everyone, you weigh them up against other teachings in the scriptures always. But someone had such a profound ability to engage the ideas of his day, see the richness of other contributions, but recognize these things needed to be brought in order rightly in light of Christ, and just the range and depth of a figure like that. And even sort of the incompleteness. I mean, one thing you'll get about Augustine, he'll start a work and then walk away from it for years, and then he picks up on it. And when we read it, we don't really catch that there was a huge amount of growth and development in that period. But anyway, I don't want to I could stay on Augustine probably the whole night.
The other note I wanted to throw in is there's an entire subfield of history called history of emotions. And I know people who have been working on the psychological systems that are embedded in Christian spirituality through the Middle Ages and actually straight through to the Puritans.
Yeah.
So that's another aspect of this that is heavily Augustinian, but not exclusively.
Wow. Yeah, I didn't realize that. But I think you will see. I mean, one of the things that you see very much with Augustine's engagement, especially with the Stoic tradition. One of the things he found problematic with the Stoics was that while they recognize that you have to live, you will suffer. That the Stoics attempt at being the kind of rugged, hard individual, of confronting that by becoming indifferent, if you will. And this is the way Augustine read it. So, I'm no Stoic scholar, so I don't know whether he read it rightly or not. But the way he read that was something that needed to be changed. Is that no, actually, the way in which we relate to suffering as Christians is a process through which our desires can be open to being formed and refashioned the right way, so that we begin to love and relate to things in a richer way. And so this is where Augustine's, theology, of ordering loves begins to really take shape, with his recognition that we're desirous creatures. And that the whole pagan world, and if anything, John Calvin will say the world is religious and desirous. We have a seed of religion, right? That he'll often say, groping in the dark and fashioning idols constantly, because we do recognize that there is something beyond, the material, if you will, or the pleasurable. To which suffering becomes a complicated problem. And I think Augustine recognized the Stoics were willing to face that head on. But what they didn't do is push deeper and more openly to the fact that we recognize in suffering a certain finitude that pushes us into a deeper relation with being, and, of course, the love that's at the heart of creation. And that suffering isn't for becoming hard and indifferent. It's actually the other way around, for developing friendship and restoring loves and all the like. But anyway, this goes very deep into the notion of persona and persons as communicative and in relation, but also ultimately what they are as persons is fundamentally given by their relatedness to, the personal God. And I think that key dimension will be how religion is understood. We often make a division, a divide between, religion versus relationship. That would not have been understood in Augustine's world. It was the kind of relationship we're all religious. We all have an orientation towards that which we're devoted to. That's what it means to be human. We're worshipers of something. We set our love and affections on things. Well, Augustine is saying that we are not to set our loves on anything but the infinite source and person behind all things, and that this is a communicative relationship with each other and with God. And so the personal and the unique and the gifted really start to come to burst into the theological world and into the wider Western culture, to where eventually you'll get figures like Boethius, Richard of St. Victor. When you really read Richard of St. Victor, for example, on the Trinity, you see how the personal and the love and the desires are very rich. It's almost romantic language. And that really is at post-Augustine. And this isn't flowery stuff. We often think of it kind of as, poetic and flowery. It's the other way around. It's facing suffering without suffering demolishing that fullest sense of what it means to commune with God and others. So it's not kind of softness. It's actually, you could also say it's much more rich than indifference.
So, Tom, how does this kind of bring us to the title of that chapter? So, because that was an intriguing thing, because it's very much in contrast with what you've been talking about to this point.
That's right. So the contrast works with the way and how in the world do we start? Does the degradation begin? And so he really traces the West and the degradation of this rich understanding of the human having this distinct person, gift, and dignity, even fallen.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So what I'm hearing you say is, what we have with Augustine is something real, and something that is contrasted with something virtual, which gets us to this title.
Yes. Well, how we get to the virtual, what Rist begins doing is really looking at the way in which this rich picture starts to be chipped away. And what he begins talking about, though, is at first, this chipping away is because, as we've talked about in other shows, a distorted view of God is basically imposing, as one great agent, imposing his will on everything else. And if we don't like it, we can just either suck it up or rebel against it, right? That, the Promethean fist in the face of God. That competitive view eventually will lead to religion being looked at by the elite scholars, if you will, that see it really as a kind of supreme superstition, as this God is basically despotic and irrational and capricious, and so only a fool would believe it, but many fools do believe it. And so how in the world do we manage with our elite enlightened understanding to not to really continue to be elite, to impact the whole, to bring some along that are capable of being brought along, without just throwing everything into chaos? And so part of the story is the way in which the first Enlightenment sought to kind of have all the riches of the Christian vision, the morality, the view of the person, but without the God that it's attached to. And so what you begin, as Dostoevsky once said, once you get rid of that God, you're going to eventually get rid of the human person as well, which is really what this story is about. So what you do is have that first step of kind of the virtual, if you will, is that morality and religion are sort of an illusion that a lot of people hold to. But as political philosophers and philosophers, we need to somehow utilize that to keep a kind of what he calls here a social glue in place, so that we can kind of take the planks out one by one and bring some along that are enlightened and, whatever for the rest. And it's that whatever for the rest attitude that is really where he starts taking this picture.
Yeah, this reminds me of sort of the vital lie that Plato alludes to in different points in time. There are myths that have to be believed by the masses to be literally so in order for the society to function, even though the enlightened don't necessarily believe these things to be so.
Yes. And he alludes to it. He also to Plato's uncle, Critias. Is that how you say it? I'm trying to Critias.
I can't recall.
But who's the one? He's the one who basically said that the gods were invented by a bunch of basic charlatans to manipulate others.
Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins thinks that's a new idea that no one ever.
That's right. That's right.
That might be possible. Yeah.
That's right. And one of the things Rist talks about is that was a speculative idea for Plato and the others. I mean, Plato didn't even think it was possible because he grew up in such a religiously infused world, that religion, and for him, Plato in the Republic will actually talk about the way in which, in politics, it's okay to lie for the benefit of the Republic, but don't do that in religion. But eventually what you start to see is this kind of move. And we've talked about Machiavelli and other figures that can kind of see, weighing expediency and the beliefs of the people and things like that. But what Rist is onto is something a little bit more sinister. And one of the things that he really brings into the topic is the increased way in which, especially through the utilitarians, and who are the utilitarians? Well, there are a handful of philosophers that don't really see inherent goodness stamped into creation, in which you can know something of and know how properly to relate to it or not. It really evaluates things based on what you would call the hedonistic calculus, if you will. That which brings the maximal amount of good as pleasure to the largest amount of people, and so it's they see it as scientific, mathematic, but it's ripped from any kind of realist vision of there being an inherent good in the nature of things to which we have to orient ourselves.
Yeah, I think one way to put it is utilitarians think that the world is good for certain things, but they don't actually think that the world is good. And
that's right.
It's pretty close to kind of the Gnostic outlook. And we've talked about this before, where the Gnostics, they did believe that the world, the physical world, was created by kind of a bungling deity. and that our spirits belong to some other deity, and we're trapped here. And I've actually heard contemporary thinkers and scientists, when they talk about the world, sound an awful lot like Gnostics in that respect. That the world isn't as sort of beautiful and as well thought out as we might like to believe. So it's particularly something you hear with the transhumanists. People like Ray Kurzweil. We can improve on this, that kind of thing. But anyway, but this idea though that the world isn't good because God has made it, but it's good because it's something that we can use to make what we want and bring ourselves some happiness in the process, is a very different view than the older Christian view.
Yeah. And Glenn,
I'm just struck by sort of the opposite end of this, but also can get sort of into a kind of techno-Gnosticism. And that's the dark green guys who see the world as intrinsically good and human beings as a blight on it. Where the ultimate good is the health and the survival of the planet, and evil really consists of human degradation of the environment. It's sort of the opposite extreme of what Chris was talking about, where it completely negates the value of the individual or of the human. Whereas in Chris's side, it, I would argue, does the same thing, but gets at it from a completely different direction.
Yeah, and both of these outlooks have a lot of social cachet today, and lead in some odd ways to similar outcomes. On the one hand, the dark green people think that it would be great if we were all sterilized so that we can't reproduce and sort of spread the blight. Or, then you've got then you have the techno-Gnostics who would just like to make children irrelevant because we're all going to live forever if we can engineer, the human body to last forever.
Well, and then there are also the techno-Gaians who are going to argue that we can use technology and transhumanist principles to create people that will have a much lighter footprint on the environment. That won't need to consume as much. That won't, fill in the blank.
Yeah. So I guess that we can just get by on fewer calories or something like that. We're just much smaller.
Yeah, well, that's actually part of it.
Yeah. Interesting.
Well, what you have there, is the chipping away of the kind of human person and the privileged and special place it plays in the Christian vision and the Western vision influenced by the Christian vision. But again, it's not, as he's talking about, it wasn't easy. It's not easy to sell that until you get enough people on board and enough backing, right? Now they feel more confident to say it out loud. But one of the things that is noticeable is you sort of have this step where someone like Jeremy Bentham will say he has no time for religion, has no time for metaphysics. They saw that as or they use that for a term for really philosophy. They saw especially with John Stuart Mill and Comte, the sociologists will basically be the theologians, of the future. Because that's really what you're dealing with at this point, social phenomena. But anyway, one of the things is there kind of were in-house debates for, is there positive use for religion and classical moral virtue or not? John Stuart Mill would actually try to retrieve some of Plato's virtue because he saw this kind of radical utilitarianism as kind of, if you will, moving too fast and sweeping away everything they wanted to gain, because it would unglue the society too quickly. But he wanted to rip it from the transcendent. So ultimately he ends up in the same place. But the real interesting thing here comes with this figure, Henry Sidgwick, who I don't know a lot about his background. Do any of you know much about his background? But he's a follow-up utilitarian. He's going to develop these ideas, and he wrote several significant books. One was called Methods in Ethics. But one of the things you begin to notice in his writing and in his speeches and in his talk is that he embraces, all in the name of this utilitarianism, which he saw as a profound aspect of the Enlightenment and that only the elite educated really had access to, that he gives a full stamp to the approval of what is called massive deception in the hope of, here's a quote, of protecting society from unpleasant truths, right? And so there is a way in which he begins to see the rest of society as not adult, as immature and not capable of this kind of enlightenment maturity in which they need to be the parent to. And as a good parent, is you're not going to tell the child the whole picture. You're going to just tell them what's enough to protect them from the truth, for their own good, for their own survival, for their own safety. And so this was his kind of his strong emphasis. So what you see is a distortion now of the dignity of these of common adults as real persons, if you will, now as basically being seen as immature persons or a lesser kind of person than the elites that need a certain kind of guidance, direction, and even a detachment. This is where the virtual dimension comes in. A detachment where you give them a virtual religion, a virtual story of truth, even if it's the one they already hold, but it's not the real one from the Enlightenment perspective. And it's for their good. I mean, this is the kind of argument.
There are a couple of things that come to mind. One is, the thing that you've been stressing, how this is a detachment from the classical Christian understanding, and how, the classical understanding of the human being was informed by, there being a relationship to a transcendent God, and human beings are made in his image and consequently possess, by virtue of their relationship to God and being made in God's image, an inherent dignity. Now we have just kind of an approach with utilitarianism, which thinks of human beings as kind of objects to manipulate. Yeah. And these objects have, unfortunately, certain sort of, internal characteristics, meaning ideas, old-fashioned ideas, which make them difficult to maybe manage. Yeah. and then you do, you move to your comment about sociology replacing theology. Well, what sociologists did was describe, but that's not what the utilitarians are thinking about. What they're thinking about is proscribe, and so shape and mold these people. What you have is a kind of a set of intellectual and social conditions emerging within which totalitarianism becomes almost inevitable.
Well, this is where he's going to go with this. This is the totalitarian's dream, to be able to detach here and the way and this is what I found illuminating, because I'd never really connected the deep ways in which the utilitarians and I didn't, were involved in this, and I didn't really pick up on the deep loathing, is what he puts it on here. What you see with Sidgwick is already a tendency to patronize the unenlightened, if not despise them, perhaps as not yet real persons, right? This is how they relate. And so they can't become real persons until they're enlightened. It's kind of like, I don't know if you remember during the whole, Trump-Russia collusion stuff, the FBI agent who was having the tryst with some lawyer, and they were texting back and forth about Trump voters being these vile Walmart-wearing people. It's this kind of patronizing, or deplorable, this kind of notion that we're in the enlightened group. We keep the truth from these, rubes. And that we despise them. We almost hate. And what you can see here is that quick step to despise not real persons, not like us, to becoming dispensable, manipulatable, not having their values upheld, not giving them the dignity of right, or whatever else goes along with it, to the level of the barbaric, allowing them to be sacrificed for the pleasurable good of the enlightened, elite or the whole.
Yeah. What I'm struck by is the degree to which this aligns so well with, well, for example, communism. You look at the Soviet Union, the elites had a completely different set of rules that they operated by than the masses, and they were feeding the masses a bunch of lies. Although actually, if you read today, I just read yesterday, and I think it was Foreign Affairs, a Russian diplomat who just resigned. And what you find happening even there, according to him, even in the Russian foreign ministry, there is a total faith that whatever it is that's coming out of Moscow is the gospel truth. And therefore, even if it bears no resemblance to reality, they, to all appearances, believe it and accept it and certainly act as if it's true. So it's even among the elites where they're lying to themselves about what's happening. That's, by the way, why this guy ended up quitting.
Well, it's interesting because I think that's the point here with his movement, that virtual morality, which becomes, as he said here, that basically individuals must be tricked in order for humanity to be safe. I mean, that's one of the things that is behind this move. What you have is the next step is, basically propaganda as the social glue. And it almost becomes necessary for elites to start believing it themselves at some given point in some way, still enough to direct it and control it. But on the other hand, I mean, it's like the old, I don't know if they had a book about it, but I think it was also a film basically called There's No Murder in Paradise, which was similar. It was about, in Russia, in which a guy basically reported a murder he saw, into which they send him to re-education camps to let him know there is no murder in paradise. That was not a murder,
Yeah, we have that all the time in Portland, Oregon. There are all kinds of crimes that are committed every day, but they're not really crimes. So remember Joshua Mitchell? We talked about an article that he had published in First Things sometime back. I think he was an Erasmus lecture guy. Anyways, he was at the Touchstone conference I was at last week. But both, I think, in that article and in his talk, he talked at Touchstone. He talked about a transition that occurred in the early days of the American Republic. The ideal was the competent citizen, which meant that, people who are property owning citizens are learning competence and are competent to manage their own affairs. Then we get to the early 20th century and we have the rise of the progressives, people who are really kind of the, sort of the elite and administrative class. And we are promoting competence with those folks. So those folks are supposed to be competent. And what we find ourselves seeing emerge today is that we don't even want competence anymore. So, we go from like everybody should be competent to a few people should be competent to nobody is competent. and we end up with institutions which are losing their ability to instill competence. I read something by Alan Dershowitz today, I think in Newsweek, and he was lamenting, great inflation and the fact that we are graduating incompetence from elite institutions now. So even at the highest levels, we're not willing to apply standards uniformly. Yeah. There are certain classes of people who are exempt. Well, what does that mean? Well, that means that the standard's actually lower for everybody, not just for that group.
Well, that's the irony here is that, utilitarianism is a form of consequentialist ethics. In other words, the ends justify the means if the ends basically produce the maximal amount of pleasure for the maximal amount of, people, or however that it really the maximal amount of pleasure for the small elite is really what what you have going on here, but making everyone else think it's for the majority. But also just that very philosophy itself already has the ability to exclude all those that aren't part of the maximal benefiting. And so you have built into utilitarianism a notion that some persons aren't fully persons if they're not part of. This is part of why, even in the secular variants of individual rights and things like that, still we're holding on to a semblance of the Christian view of the person, which meant, look, just because the maximal benefit doesn't mean it should still be done in overriding these other people who have the dignity of being made in the image of God, or, being human beings.
Yeah, fundamentally, the utilitarian approach, along with a lot of other modern approaches to ethics or postmodern approaches, basically ignores anything like the rights of the individual. The only thing that really matters is how you measure the happiness, I don't know, but all that matters is the good of the majority. And if that means destroying the individual, so be it.
Yeah.
Now, I have an interesting example. I just looked up. I quoted. This is some quotes from my book, Why You Think the Way You Do, that I tracked down. Timothy Worth, former U.S. Senator, Democrat, Colorado, commented, now this has to do with global warming. We've got to ride the global warming issue. Even if the theory of global warming is wrong, we will be doing the right thing in terms of economic policy and environmental policy. Or, another quote, environmentalist Stephen Schneider argued, quote, we have to offer up scary scenarios, make simplified, dramatic statements, and make little mention of any doubts we may have. Each of us has to decide what the right balance is between being effective and being honest.
Well, that's the same
kind of thing that we're talking about, in a nutshell.
Yeah, that's the same obscurantism that we witnessed with COVID. And we saw the damage that it was done. No one's allowed to question. No one's allowed to think independently. Everybody's supposed to parrot the party line, even though maybe in the faculty, sort of break rooms, they're talking about, well, maybe this isn't actually so, that kind of stuff. But they can't give even the slightest indication that they may have a doubt when it comes to the party line.
Yeah, how dare those, whatever you would call those rubes, those religious zealots, question the efficacy of what, our elites say will keep you safe and allow you to survive. And so you can give up your freedom and your ethical responsibility to weigh these things and hand them right over to those who know better, even if they're wrong and they know they're wrong, and even if they don't want to look at it. And then as you come to see later on, as you see all the sinister interests behind those that were pushing a lot of the things, you begin to see that, what you get, all you get is a bunch of, passing it off to the other person who, someone else is guilty or, it seemed the best thing to do at the time. And it's disturbing. I just heard California is putting through, or a bill is coming through that basically makes it illegal, or you're charged if you question publicly what the consensus of certain interpretations of science have. That's the end of science.
Right. Yeah.
Falsifiability. Once falsifiability and questionability are done, you're dealing with pure ideology.
Yeah. Right. Well, and then you run into things like a quote I saw this week from Bill Gates, who said, we had no idea that COVID was not as serious as we thought it was, that it's really not much more than a flu. Where had we heard that before?
Yeah, I remember the Orange Man says something similar. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, but we had no idea. Nobody had any clue about this. Well, yeah, actually, the conspiracy theorists and the science deniers did.
Yeah. Some of those science deniers were actually PhDs and actually scientists.
Well, we'll ignore that fact. But I find the subject really interesting because in fact, what we are seeing is a constant drumbeat of propaganda.
Yeah.
Not just from the government, but now, interestingly enough, the media, which is supposed to be the watchdog, is parroting the same thing. Yeah. Big tech is parroting the same thing. And if you dare question it, you get, well, in California, you get arrested, but elsewhere you get canceled or silenced or sent to Facebook jail or whatever.
Yeah. My suspicion is that the totalitarianism that we are seeing emerge is distinguishable from the forms that it's taken in the past by two things. One is it's more sanitary, because the optics of concentration camps are just bad, and so the authorities don't want that kind of thing. But the other is just the spontaneous character of it. So we don't need some maniacal individual like a Stalin or a Hitler to make this thing come to pass or sort of see this thing develop. It's almost as though it's kind of like ad hoc. It's like it's emerging from just the internet or something, if you get my drift. That there's a kind of momentum to it. And then next thing you know, everybody's hopping on board and nobody wants to be, that guy whose tweet was reproduced 15 million times and made, an object of scorn across the world. Everybody's sort of like canceling themselves first in a bad way. And then, because they're self-censoring. They're afraid to say what's on their minds.
Yeah. Now, the implications of this are really interesting if you take it to some of the next steps. Political and economic systems tend to run hand in hand because they're both based on common premises about what natural human relations look like. So feudalism in medieval Europe had its economic counterpart as manorialism, is built around the same premises. I don't expect you to know what those were, but trust me on that. When you're dealing with republicanism and the idea that we have the right to elect our representatives, that's really compatible with free market economics. You get to choose your leaders, you get to choose your job, you get to choose what to spend your money on, you get to choose what store you go to, what you buy, all of those kinds of things. It's all a matter of the choice of the individual is really the thing that controls that. Now, when you move to the direction we're moving now, where you've got the expert class and the rubes, and the expert class will lie to the rubes for their own good, what you're really dealing with is a system that is built around a technocratic elite that runs the government, which then has its economic counterpart as socialism. We've got to have an economic elite that governs the economy.
Yeah.
They run together. And it's no accident that socialism is growing in popularity among the young. Because number one, they don't know their history. But number two, we're increasingly being told we should shut up and listen to the experts.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think you also have this kind of way in which, again, religion and even the religionist kind of promote some of this. I mean, you often see them that the kind of having almost a moral elite, if you will. This group tends to be the virtuous, and therefore tends to embody that kind of virtue and humanitarianism, that kind of capitalist society with their kind of uncultivated choices running in every direction, greed, selfishness, and all of this. It's a very naive understanding of socialism, first of all, but it's propaganda. I mean, it's the same thing you have going on here. The elites are not virtuous. They're not virtuous, and they're not the governors of virtue.
I think, one of the things many evangelicals have had a hard time sort of kind of working through is we thought that the mainline Protestant churches were the people who behaved that way, Tom. What we discovered over the last 2, 3, 4 years is that we have a kind of emerging sort of junior varsity evangelical mainline, and those folks have been operating in ways that many of us feel are eerily similar to the things that we see in other parts of our political elites. There's a kind of working along. You're familiar with Meg Besham and her work on what the guys at the CDC and NIH we're doing in terms of kind of actually working behind the scenes, coordinating with certain evangelical big evil leaders to try to get their program out and sort of quell any dissent coming from the evangelical side of the world. And, you wonder, why is it certain evangelical leaders do have a platform in places like the Washington Post or the New York Times? Well, they might think it's just because they're so respected, but perhaps it's because they're useful.
Well, I think, and I think that's correct. And I think one side to it, I don't want to go far down the saying it, but I think the pragmatism that a lot of evangelical Christianity as a whole adopted, but a lot of it adopted in what works socially, makes them very susceptible to that kind of utilitarian being manipulated or exploited by it, because what works effectively is modeled on how it is received by its culture, how the culture despisers.
Right.
One thing that I don't understand at this point, and I know that there are all kinds of theories about this, but the Surgeon General of Florida comes out and says that the COVID vaccines increase heart trouble in people 19 to 34 years old, particularly males. He's got the data, he's got the evidence. He gets kicked off Twitter for saying this, because Twitter, of course, has greater experts who actually know the situation better than he does. I doubt it. What are they after? What is the CDC after? What are the drug companies that suppress these results that show that, I mean, they're out now. The numbers are horrendous. Any other vaccine historically that had even a tiny fraction of these numbers of adverse reactions has been pulled from the market. Why is it that this one has got this dispensation to ignore all that? Why is it that so much is questioning it is grounds for canceling, even if you are the Surgeon General of Florida? This is, I think, a great example of what you're talking about, of an elite lie that is being promoted for our own good, except objectively it isn't. So what are they after?
Yeah, and I think this is, I mean, there are a few things I think just that come to mind. I mean, one is, I think the coalition, if you will, as Chris was mentioning earlier, of almost a united voice of propaganda from not just one group, say the pharmaceutical industry, but the way in which they're now all in bed together, if you will. And by being in bed together, they are very much more powerful, because they create a propaganda campaign that, like Chris was saying, that you almost come against yourself in order to not be canceled by or shut out or lose your bank account because of this kind of totalitarian drive. I do think it's global at this point. There's no way of getting across it. As a matter of fact, might as well bring it up while it's on my mind. Where is the just war folk? We're in a mess. We're almost on the brink of from the rhetoric of nuclear war, and I have heard almost zip and nothing from the morals, from the moral reflection of the church. It's almost silent. But anyway,
you've probably seen those memes, in which it's sort of the rabid woke girl says, "Oh no, Trump is going to bring World War III upon us," and then in the next picture she's happy and smiling. "Oh boy, we're going to have World War III."
World War III, yeah.
Just because it's our team now that's the possible sort of perpetrator.
But the moral lunacy of bringing rhetoric to that level of what could be. I mean, if you just think of the way, say let's just talk the Catholic probably right around 60s and 70s in Vietnam, the way in which some of the left, but also kind of the Catholic social teaching, I mean, they were radically involved in questioning a lot of the motives of different wars, Vietnam, different things. We may or may not agree with them. But the way that those voices were constantly challenging, or you just think of the 80s against, the stuff Bush was involved with, in the attention that those who, but like you said, once they're the ones running the game, there is literally not in the church hardly anything mentioned about something that could have much more damaging effect on large swaths of humanity. And again, there's this kind of moral fogginess.
Yeah. Well, maybe it gets back to this whole idea of the lie. So what we have with utilitarians is, okay, we need to keep the Rubes happy. We don't believe in the Christian faith any longer, but they do. So we're going to utilize that in order to maintain a social order. We'll continue to pursue our agenda. And leave them to their illusions, and every once in a while maybe give a nod in that direction. But what's happening, of course, is fundamentally dishonest. And now we've moved into a new phase of the dishonesty. And it strikes me that we are really at a point that brings to mind the Babel story, in Genesis, where in that case the Lord confuses their language or their speech, so they can't communicate with each other any longer. But aren't we at that point in the sense that language has become so divorced from what it's supposedly referring to, or in other words, when we speak, there is the promise that we're at least endeavoring to say something that's true. Now we're at a point where you're not like taking anybody's word for anything. Everybody is just full of doubt and suspicion, and it's everywhere. It's in the churches, it's in our personal relationships, it's in our relationship to the government and to the authorities. It's everywhere.
Look at the names of the laws that Congress passes.
They're all lies. We can all see through them. They're not even convincing.
Well, and it's like you said, and coupled with that is likewise the way in which, like you said, language detached from reality, and then reason itself everything being suspicious. Reason is nothing more than a rhetorical ploy for people to manipulate others in their direction, to oppress others, or whatever. And so what you have is no real rational way in many cases to resolve things. The old moral way of confronting. Now, it's interesting that they're very frightened by any kind of challenge on Twitter or something of their narrative. I mean, it's that fragile. But because they do know the power of language, because there are still, as Rist is getting to, human persons who think that when things are spoken by their government or by institutions they used to have trust, they mean it. They have their interest at heart. And if they break that kind of bond of trust, it's like Rist says it here. He said, he goes, individuals must be tricked in order that humanity may be safe, or at least judged to be safe, albeit when the deceived detect the deception, society may actually suffer worse damage than what would have occurred had truth been told. But we're not allowed to, I'll give you an example. One of the things he talks about is the way in which some of these philosophers recognize that philosophically things are deterministic, but we cannot let the masses who think they have some kind of responsible moral action think that they don't. Because what will happen to all of our societal aims for justice when they realize there really isn't anything called justice, right? So we need to let them think that there is something that they are morally responsible for, so that they will keep the society glued together and think that they're pursuing things like righteousness and just social order. And this gets right into the whole issue with like the critical theory, right? Who uses language of justice and social justice. only hold some people responsible, and other people are actually the perpetrators who actually use freedom the wrong way when no one else has freedom. So you have this whole picture, but to challenge it, to make any claim that, wait a minute, maybe this is irrational and therefore untrue, is merely just looked at as you taking your privilege and power and trying to subvert a narrative that was left out previously and therefore deserves to have the dignity of being taken seriously. And so we are in a mess.
Yeah. In every scenario in which there's a lie, there is somebody who's the mark, the trusting person. The person who kind of is not fully in on the secret. And, the case that you just described with, late 19th century utilitarianism, early 20th century progressivism, the rube was the average citizen, right? And you had this small, sort of cabal of people who were putting it over on everybody else. But it only worked if everybody else really was a rube.
That's right.
The moment they catch on, they're like, I'm not going along with these guys anymore. I know what they're up to.
The interesting thing is that that's exactly what happens in totalitarian societies.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
That the people learn very, very fast that you cannot trust what the media is saying. And it's not even extreme totalitarian societies. I ran into someone from Portugal who said that whenever you read the news, what she had learned growing up in Portugal is that when you read the news, you need to ask a couple of questions. Why are they telling me this? And what aren't they telling me?
Now, isn't that true with most American media today? Right.
Yes.
We're kind of at that point. And getting back to the woke thing, the woke agenda only works if the target group that's supposed to be made to feel bad and guilty, are still operating by the old Christian values. The moment they say, okay, I see how this works, you're just using this against me in order to accrue power. Well, why should I let you do that to me? I can lie back, and so then you have just total war of all against all. And then, is that really what they want? Of course not. They want the rest of us to operate by sort of the old standards of fairness, and not have those standards applied to them.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, actually, I would argue that wokeness is a recipe for creating white supremacists.
Well, that's what I'm getting at. Because that's what it leads to. If you say, okay, the only way that this plays out is the most powerful win, well, okay, here we go. I'm just going to be for my team.
That was, basically, we've talked about this before. That was basically Nietzsche's point. He was basically saying that he criticized Christianity as basically providing what could be called the slave revolt. And he despised Christianity because, one, it empowered the weak, in Nietzsche's interpretation, to guilt with those ideals that would resonate, or you could kind of guilt them into being shamed that they had power and privilege and everything else, so that they would, deny it and allow that kind of the slave to kind of uprise and then basically take over. And Nietzsche kind of admired it because of the way it could manipulate through guilt to bring the powerful down and to exalt the weak. He thought it was like a fancy trick, if you will, but he despised it for that. So he wanted something much, much stronger.
But isn't it true, Tom, that Nietzsche didn't fall for it? In other words, Nietzsche would mock those people. And
he did.
It's possible for you and I to get to a place where you say, hey, call me anything you want.
Yeah.
Call me every name in the book. It doesn't affect me. It doesn't penetrate. I know what you're up to. It doesn't work.
Yeah.
We've been in those classes where people have played those games on us, and we just look them in the eye and say, "Ooh."
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's the thing. It only works again, the way that what I'm talking about in this whole chapter works. The way in which you have language that the elites think of basically as conventional, but it's really a holdover from Christianity. but it's been detached from the transcendent, and it is now seen basically as an illusion by the elites that they know still has a capture on the imagination of the rest of society. And so they can play with it then to do a lot of these things. And that's what, especially in the academic world, they're constantly doing. They're playing with it and carrying out a lot of, the consequences are becoming quite unbearable for the average person nowadays.
And I think too, for the academic elites, I get the daily email from the Chronicle of Higher Education, and they're getting more and more shrill and more crazy with all of their headlines. It's kind of amusing. Anyway, we should probably wrap things up here. We've got a live audience here, and we're going to segue to a question and answer time here in a minute. But we should bring this part of the show to an end so that we can sign off. Is there anything you want to say, Glenn, as we do that?
This whole discussion has been making me think of COVID. It's been making me think of, pick your cause du jour. Every single one of them seems to line up very, very nicely with this. Yeah. Anything you want to say as we wrap up this part of our time, Tom?
Just the last word is kind of, I think another time do a show basically on how we as Christians are to deal with a lot of this. And one of which is, I think, the issue of trust, building trust with faithful, truthful conversation and character. But that's a whole show of its own. But I think it does, like Glenn said, touch on things we're constantly dealing with, even in the church and its hierarchy, if you will.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for listening to the Theology Pugcast. You made it to the end of another show. We will have a question and answer time, and that means there's going to be a bonus show that you can listen to that will post after this one does, and we welcome you to listen to that. There are folks out there who support us on a regular basis through Patreon, through the Fight, Laugh, Feast network. We're very grateful for those folks. There are folks who even track us down to give us money in other ways. And it's all very, very helpful. It does pay the bills. So thank you for all of that. Anyway, that's it for now. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.